Everybody ready? Let's go. Hello and welcome tonight to this panel discussion on Print Town, the Brattleboro's legacy of words, part of the Brattleboro Words Project. We're very happy you can be joining us in the virtual space. My name is Olga Peters and I am a local freelance journalist here in Brattleboro. And tonight we have a number of the talent and folks and authors behind Print Town with us tonight. So glad you can be here with us. I'm going to start on my left and introduce the panelists. I would like to introduce John Rice Hooper, who is said to have been born with printer's ink in his veins.
Right.
He is the son of John S. and Marion Rice Hooper, who were part of Stephen Day Press and the Reformer, and the grandson of Howard C. Rice, who was the founder of the Reformer in 1913. He too entered the printing and publishing business. His newspaper career spanned 35 years. He retired in 1992 as senior vice president of Guy Gannett Publishing, headquartered in Portland, Maine, where he still resides. And as much as he loves Maine, he still loves his hometown of Brattleboro. Thank you for joining us tonight, John.
Thank you.
Arlene Disler. Welcome, Arlene. Arlene is the co-founder of Right Action, which was the lead organization along with the Brattleboro Historical Society for the publication and creation of Print Town. She is active in helping to organize and promote reading events and bringing about collaborations between the arts and the community. Disler is also a journalist and poet who has been writing about the arts for local, regional, and national publications for 20 years. Her poetry can be read in numerous journals and anthologies. A chapbook titled Voices Like Wind Chimes was published through Finishing Line Press in 2014, and she has edited and co-edited 3 collections of writing by poets and writers in the tri-state region of Vermont, Southern Vermont, New Hampshire, and Western Massachusetts. So thank you for joining us tonight, Arlene. Next to Arlene is Michael Fleming, and he was born in San Francisco, raised in Wyoming, and has lived and learned and worked all around the world, including Thailand, England, and Swaziland, and Berkeley, and New York City. The list keeps going. This is fantastic, Michael. So glad you're here. New York City and now Brattleboro, Vermont. He's been a teacher, a grad student, a carpenter, and always a writer. For the past 15 years, he has edited literary anthologies for W.W. Norton, and you can see some of his own writing at his website, dutchgirl.com/foxpaws. And Michael is also the editor of Print Town. So thank you for putting your pen to this very deep history of Brattleboro's literary history and print history. On the other side of Michael is Nancy A. Olson. Hi, Nancy. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Olga. Thank you.
Nancy first came to southeastern Vermont to attend Windham College in Putney. She felt so at home here that she returned to Putney in 1972 to start her adult life. After teaching English and journalism at Brattleboro Union High School for 35 years, she retired in 2013. Since then, she has freelanced for the Brattleboro Reformer, Upcountry Magazine, and The Commons. Words have thrilled her since childhood, she says, and writing about her topic for Print Town, Clarina Howard Nichols, has been fascinating. So thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Andy Burrows. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
Now, you came to Brattleboro in 1966, joining Stephen and Janet Green as managing editor of the Stephen Green Press. During 5 years with the Greens, he handled book production and consulted on editing, book sales, advertising, and book design. In 1980, Andy started ProLingua Associates, which he wrote about in Printtown. Using both his publishing and teaching skills, he focused on book design, production, and sales. After 40 years with over 100 titles still in print and digital editions, ProLingua is known around the US and the world. Andy is also on the board of Right Action and has served on the boards of the Brattleboro Museum as well as Vermont Public Radio. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
And finally, Rolf Parker Houghton. He was one of the principal historians for the Brattleboro Words project that generated Printtown. You can read a lot of his work, especially in the section prior to the 1900s. He is a freelance writer who has published articles on local history in the Deerfield Valley News, the Brattleboro Reformer, and the Commons. He also collaborates with his wife, Cynthia, to create humorous and historically themed puzzles, which reveal treasures hidden on local trails, which are published by the Keene Sentinel's Elf magazine. Rolf lives with his wife and teenage son in Brattleboro. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So thank you again for everyone being here tonight and sharing your experience of putting together Printtown with us and the viewers. I'd like to start with Arlene and share with us, how did this book come to be? And why did you want to be involved in this book to begin with?
Okay, so thinking about my involvement and how the book came to be, the words that stand out are synchronicity and serendipity, because it was kind of remarkable. The Board of Right Action, I guess we were looking for a next project, and we started talking about delving into the history of Brattleboro's printing and publishing businesses, its history. So we would meet and talk about that some. And then we found out that the Historical Society was, in fact, doing the same thing. And they already had a timeline of printing businesses. So that was kind of fantastic. And Mary Ide, who was working with the Historical Society on that chronology, joined our group. So it was 3 out of a board of 5 on Right Action, and then Mary. So the 4 of us were meeting about this idea of looking into the history. Maybe a little book would come of it. And then we went to this meeting that Lissa called, and she had heard about an NEH grant and thought there should be a way that Brattleboro can take advantage of this new grant. We went to a meeting that she called that had many heads of organizations, Marlborough College, the library. There must have been 11 or 12 people. And she said, any ideas of what we can do with this grant? Mary and I were both there. And I kind of timidly said, what about the history of printing? And everybody, it was like an idea whose time had come. People just really responded. So we could not have accomplished what we have with this book if it weren't for Lissa. Thank you, Lissa, and the NEH grant. because it certainly grew from a very small vision to a very large vision. And it was just a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Arlene. I'd love to hear from Andy, because you've been involved with Right Action, and I believe you were on the book committee who was working on this piece. How did you become involved, and what excited you about working on Print Town?
Well, I have to go back one or two steps before Arlene's starting point, because I came to Brattleboro in '66, as you said, to work for Janet and Stephen Green, and got to know the Hoopers, and just this extraordinary collection of people involved in printing and writing and designing in Brattleboro. We used to joke that you couldn't turn a stone over in Brattleboro without finding a printer. And then several years later, I think it was, yes, it was after I had left the Stephen Green Press and had gone up to what's now World Learning, the Experiment, to get my master's in teaching English as a second language. I got engaged in the Brattleboro Museum, and they were just starting. And so, a little bit like what you described, Arlene, well, what shall we do? Because it's a weird combination. It is a history museum and an art museum put together. Well, it's easy to come up with artists in this community, but how are we going to come up with the really powerful history to start the museum, to have an exhibit? And I threw out the idea, well, there's so many printers in this and publishers in this town, and there's such a rich history. Why don't we put together an exhibit? And we did. We started asking questions, and suddenly people were jumping in with ideas and contributing artwork and whatnot related to it, so that we filled the museum full of material dealing with the printing of Brattleboro. So years went by, and we were sitting around again, saying, "What should we do at Right Action? We'd like to have a good project." And I remembered back to that time at the museum and how excited people were. And so I threw out this idea of doing a history of Brattleboro, of Brattleboro's printing. But what fascinated, I missed that great meeting where all these people came together. I was out of town. Came back, discovered there were all kinds of people interested and engaged in wanting to do something. And suddenly this whole plan had expanded, it sort of exploded. It wasn't just about printing and publishing. I had to keep saying, there is a difference between printing and publishing. I think I got the idea across eventually. But there were suddenly people interested in the history of Brattleboro and how it related to words, and people who were interested in all kinds of the famous authors and whatnot. And the book became more and more complicated. I don't know how it was ever put together.
Well, I would love that. I think that's a great segue for you, Mr. Editor. How did you become involved in Print Town? And also, why do you think there was such an excitement for this topic and the history of words in Brattleboro?
I became involved about 2 years ago when, unbeknownst to me, someone who had been retained to be the editor of the project had to drop out before really beginning. And so there was a pile of unedited manuscripts and a project waiting to happen. My next door neighbor, who happened to have been in my writing group, came to me and said, I'm the founder of the Brattleboro Words Project, Lissa Weinman, and I'd like you to consider meeting with this book committee and serving as the editor for this project. We think it may take a couple of months at least. Well,
2 years later.
So it was about 14 months and 1,000 hours of my time. 8,000 emails later, here we are. We have a beautiful book to show for it. I learned so much about this community, about how extensive the history of printing, publishing, papermaking was in Brattleboro. It's always been a magnet for authors, for people involved in the literary arts, for editors, for fine art printers, for big commercial printers, and this has gone on for 200 years. So it was fascinating to find that I'd been living in this community for 10 years and I was part of this, and I had no idea of the heritage behind me. But I did know there were a lot of other freelancers in Brattleboro, like myself. And I was very pleased then to get involved with this group of writers, artists, editors, and we made a big communal push to get this book through. And last year, just before Christmas, we finally delivered the copies that we had promised 14 months earlier.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to turn to Rolf. And because you brought so much history and research to this book, what interested you about it, and why did you want to become involved?
Well, there were just so many stories that were buried in all of the many newspapers that were in Brattleboro. There were a total of 21 newspapers, and most of those have now been digitized and are searchable. And over and over again, there's this story of people coming to Brattleboro to pull themselves out of poverty. I mean, that's the story of the Crowell story. That's the story, apparently, of T.P. James, who came here to make his fortune. It's the story of Mary Wilkins Freeman, who was also living in poverty. They were so reduced, her family, that she ended up having to move into the home of the young man that she'd fallen in love with, who didn't return her affection. So she had to, and she succeeded at first writing what she considered dreck later. But by writing and writing and writing and writing, she pulled herself out. And because of the huge publishing industry here, there were just all these fascinating characters. And that's really what made it exciting to me.
Thank you. How about for you, Nancy? How did you become involved?
Well, I've certainly known about Right Action for years. And I saw the all call. There were articles in the paper saying this project is happening. If you're interested in participating, get in touch. So I did. I talked to Arlene, and she said, submit your documentation, your qualifications, and your ideas. So I did. And she said, okay, you're on.
And what was really poignant for you?
It's funny how it happened, because I had thought I would write about something else. But I talked to Mary I, and she said, why don't you write about Clarina Irene Howard Nichols? And I said, who? And so that was a real journey for me. I'd never heard of this person. It turns out that in her day, she worked with and was as well known, perhaps even better known, as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And a fourth member of that group was Matilda Jocelyn Gage from Fayetteville, New York. Those four women they worked together. They were well known. Their work for women's rights was essential. But it's funny that really only Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are known today. So I found out a lot. I read the 2 biographies of Clarina Howard Nichols, and I just couldn't believe it. Here was this woman from West Townsend who influenced the rights of women in essential ways. And I think part of the reason that she's not well known in Vermont anymore is that she finished her career out in California. And she moved to Kansas, was very active there, and went to live with a son in California. So we lost track of her, but not anymore.
And finally, John, I know that you have an extensive history in Brattleboro, but with living in Maine, did folks reach out to you, or did you, like Nancy, answer the all call? How did you?
Well, all I know was I was a very young man when this project started. But I actually came into this project by the back door. When I had come in the front door was as a result of having subscribed to the Historical Society newsletter. And in 2015, I learned that they were going to have the year of printing and publishing in Brattleboro. So I immediately hopped on my horse, came to Brattleboro, and we talked about a number of things. And among them, and that's why Mary Ide had that timeline. That started with my visit. And the idea of a book came up. I had written some articles that I was preparing for my family to let them know what their forebears were involved with. But for reasons like money and other kinds of things, it never came to fruition. Then I got a call a couple of years later from Stephanie Green, who was a major part of this actually happening. It's too bad she's not here today. And she said, "John, where are you?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "There's a book project going on. Why aren't you involved?" I said, "I didn't know about it." So that's how I got involved. And I was born into the first half of the 20th century history of Brattleboro. And so that's what I focused on in this book.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everyone. So I want to delve in a little bit to some of the pieces that you have all worked on, and I have some questions about those. But before I do that, I want to go back to Arlene and check in and see, this was such an expansive history that you were all working with. How did you decide, how did you craft that timeline? Did you say we want to focus a lot here? We want to make sure we get these stories in. How did all that come into shape?
Some of it was what people's interests were, who were working on the book. So, and some of it was just taking this timeline, this terrific thing that you guys had done, and dividing it. When we were meeting as a little group of 4, we spent a fair bit of time talking about how we would divide the chapters. At that point, we were able to get maybe 11 writers involved. So, yeah, can you tell me the question?
No problem. This is a lot of information to craft and to give shape to. And so that was neat how you said a lot of what came into this book was based on writers' interest. But were there other parts of the history of print and publishing in Brattleboro that you really wanted to make sure ended up in the book? Or did it kind of evolve as you went along?
Well, again, I would say it's because of the people that were involved. Rich Holshoe who's in Abenaki, that's his heritage. He impressed upon us how important it would be to go back to the Native Americans who were here. And I think to many of our astonishment, there were written things that the Native Americans had come up with, had written. So, yeah, I personally, I know people in the publishing world, and I knew they had some wonderful stories. And so I wanted to get their stories. It was just a great opportunity to do that. So, yeah, probably we all have a slightly different take.
Yeah, definitely. And for folks who haven't read Printtown yet, Rich Holshoe co-authored one of the pieces in here, and he is a representative of the Elnu Abenaki tribe, which is a local tribe for our area. So, Rolf.
Yes.
You worked on a piece on Benjamin Smead. You also worked on Holbrook, and I believe it's pronounced Fessenden?
That's how I've always pronounced it, but I'm always questioning since.
Well, it's so interesting. We see these names in print, but that doesn't mean that's how they're pronounced. You co-authored that piece. You also worked on a piece about T.P. James, and you co-authored a piece on George Crowell. I'm curious, what was that like doing that research? A lot of this is prior to 1900, as I understand it. Going back to these old sources, where did you have to go to find this information?
A wide range of places. I mean, a lot of it was taken directly from the newspapers again, which were have been digitized, fortunately. But then other people have written various books related to Brattleboro's history as well, and so those were also useful. But then also trade magazines turned out. There were actually trade magazines for printing and publishing that were being printed in the 1800s. Those were also useful. But something that I found was that you discover these great stories when you were researching one thing, and then you saw on the column next to it something just unfathomable, like what? And so I'd quickly send off a note to myself, grab a picture of it and file it away when I was sometimes during bouts of insomnia that happened during all this whole process. And then I'd follow those up with further researches in the newspaper accounts, because some of these things had just been completely forgotten, or at least I didn't know about them and I couldn't find them in history books.
Interesting. So, yeah. And a lot of your research, was it done locally, or did you need to reach out to libraries?
I did have to reach out to libraries in some situations, yeah, interlibrary loan and reference librarians around. Just want to say it's a pity that Joe's not here, because he uncovered one of the most important stories related to Holbrook, which we didn't really know, or I certainly didn't know, which was that, as the title of the chapter is, Holbrook confesses in luck, hard work, and profits from slavery. And it turned out that Holbrook made a lot of his money in various ways related to supplying slave plantations and selling goods made by slave plantations. And that money he used to invest in the early publishing and paper-making industry of Brattleboro. So it was unfortunately, all intertwined with the early wildly successful. They actually managed to double the population of Brattleboro based on how successful their publishing and printing was. So Joe could speak better to that, but he wrote that portion of that chapter.
Thank you. And thank you for the reminder of interconnectedness, which brings me to Nancy. I was really curious when I was looking at your piece, which I thought it's called The Accidental Activist. Is it Clarina?
Clarina,
Clarina, thank you.
as if it were dinner.
Irene Howard Nichols, and you talk about how she came into basically the newspaper business accidentally. But what interested me is because you taught journalism for so long, and she herself went into newspaper business, but she wrote a lot about women's rights, and she used language to persuade people, which often we debate in journalism whether or not that's an okay thing. So as someone who was a teacher of journalism and working on this piece, can you respond to that? What were your thoughts?
Clarina was very, she became a avowed Baptist at the age of 8. And so was her family. She was amazingly, all of the children in her family, all 7 of them reached adulthood. So she knew the Bible really well. And she also had listened, when her father was the overseer of the poor for the town, and many of the people who came to him for help were women. And so Clarina heard story after story after story of women who needed help because their husbands had beaten them, or because their husbands were alcoholic, or had left the family. So she used those stories in her speeches, and she used Bible references in her speeches to persuade people about what should happen for women. And apparently she was really good at it. She could speak with it. She was the first woman to speak before the Vermont legislature, and spoke without notes for 90 minutes. And at the end, one of the legislators, because they were all men, of course, intended to humiliate her by giving her a pair of trousers afterwards, since she was, as a woman speaking for the legislature, clearly wanted to be a man. And instead, all of the legislators ended up applauding her. And she said, when I own my own clothes, then you can talk about wearing somebody else's. Because women didn't own anything. They had no right to their children. They didn't own their own clothing. They couldn't own property. Any money that they might have earned, she earned butter and egg money. She was apparently an excellent seamstress, and the money that she earned, she didn't own. So it was, I just learned so much. I didn't realize, even as someone who has learned something about these issues, I didn't realize how terrible it was. Women had no rights at all.
And as a teacher of journalism, when you look at someone like Clarina and how she used her power in media, how does she fit into that context of journalism for you?
Well, she knew the power of the printed word. When she started submitting pieces to the Vermont Phoenix and the Vermont Democrat, I think she did that out of the collapse of her first marriage, which was so humiliating for her. But then when she began to submit pieces, and George Washington Nichols, who was the editor of the Wind of Democrat at the time, he was looking to introduce more women's voices, and he liked what he read of hers and wanted more articles. So she really understood that the printed word could influence people's opinions, and absolutely used that throughout her career as the silent editor of the Wind of Democrat.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah.
Well, that brings me to John. We've talked about how you really grew up in the printing industry. what was it like going back and basically kind of digging into your own DNA to produce the many pieces that you produced for Printtown?
Well, it was a shock because I found out things in my first meeting that Rolf had researched about the beginnings of the Brattleboro Reformer, that I had it all wrong. So that was my introduction to it. But your question again?
Well, what was it like for you? You just touched on
Well,
it, learning
it
new,
was-
but this is your DNA. This is your family tree
Yeah.
that you were
Yeah.
kind of digging into.
I didn't write about the Reformer. Jackie Patterson Hooper, Steve's wife, wrote the piece on the Reformer, but I wrote all around it. And it required hundreds and hundreds of hours of research. And I'd like to say on behalf of the panel that this book is a result of scores of people, perhaps even in the hundreds, over a 3.5 year period of time, with thousands of hours of research and editing and other input, picture selection, et cetera, with no compensation, all volunteer hours. Tens of thousands, probably, if we were to count them all. So this is a huge, the fact that many people involved in a single project could make it happen is miraculous. It really is. And this is a great read for you folks out there. This is a very interesting book, not just because we all participated in it. So I learned a lot of things about projects that my family was involved with that I didn't know before, and some of the myths that I had in mind were ultimately corrected by the research that I did. And all of it was like a slog. It was going through page after page, edition after edition. But every once in a while, something would pop up that just blew my mind. And one of those happened to be the fact that my folks, who were the publishers in the 1930s of Stephen Day Press, closed up shop in 1943, and all 6 employees got involved in the war effort. General manager and my dad both went into the Navy. Others were involved as well, and so they sold the business. Well, I thought that was the end of the story until I came across in a trade, one of the trade magazines, that the buyer was indicted for fraud in New York City. And so that got me into that story. And
Wow.
the Stephen Day Press was sold to a con man who had impeccable credentials and was as clever as they come. He had spent 8 years in Alcatraz on similar charges of fraud. And then once he got out, he wandered across the country and he embezzled money and he defrauded widows and anybody that he could do until he ended up in Brattleboro, saw the ad that the business was for sale, worked up a resume and so forth and so on, and duped my father and my grandfather into selling to him. Now, I wondered why I never got an inheritance, but I think that may have something to do with it. But he was back at it again in New York. He was indicted. He, instead of serving 7 years in Sing Sing, he was deported back to his home country. And who knew? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And through the research, I learned something that my folks never talked about that, never mentioned that. I'm sure my dad was so embarrassed by the whole thing that he just didn't want anybody to know. But I put it in here.
Thank you, John.
Can I add something? I think you were there. Your family gave a talk maybe a year before the book project about the history of Stephen Green Press, which was so terrific. And I was there. And I have to say it was one of the inspirations for me. But I don't think that was mentioned that way.
I didn't know it then.
Yeah.
Well, I like this theme here because one, I want to go to Andy to talk a little bit about ProLingua Associates, because one theme I kept seeing in the book as I was going through it is this theme of change and how industries change and how communities change around those industries. And I think ProLingua is kind of a good example, because you talk in your piece how you started on one type of computer and now how things have gone to digital, but even how the company itself is based on trying to teach. It started with teaching some languages that a lot of people hadn't necessarily taught before for Peace Corps volunteers. How did that experience of going through so many different changes in your own publishing or printing career, how did that inform your understanding of the history of Brattleboro's printing and publishing industry?
Interesting question. My career and the development of ProLingua Associates didn't follow a straight line. There was no business plan that made any sense. I kept falling under the spell of interesting people. I left Stephen Green Press, went up to the Experiment, and all of the important magical ideas that were going on there about how we learn languages and what we do with languages. I then got engaged with this Peace Corps project. Incredibly enough, I couldn't believe it myself. In 2 years, we developed 3 books in each of 12 different languages, half of which had never been studied before. We had to find linguists to go out into the field and discover what the language was about, and then follow our Ray Clark's very practical outline of what you need to learn the language and sort of teach yourself the language. And that was an example of the kind of serendipity, came up with the word. As we started working on this project, I used to live right across the road from where Rudyard Kipling lived, and I was fascinated by Rudyard Kipling. And you can't do a book on publishing and the world of words in Brattleboro without dealing with this great charismatic genius. Conceivably not the greatest author of all of them, but at that time, the most successful author in the world was living just on the north side of Brattleboro, writing some of the books that, the Jungle Books and whatnot, right in Brattleboro. Well, this is an incredible story. How do we fit that in? There are so many stories that you just rub up against. As we started putting together this collection of ideas and say, well, we really ought to do more about the Native Americans. Okay, so we got Rich involved in the fact that there were carvings and there was a literary tradition, an oral tradition, I should say, among the Native Americans Is that related? Oh, of course, in many ways it is. And the picture became larger and larger, and more people got excited. And our editor somehow took all of this writing on all of these different subjects going in all these directions and made a coherent book out of it. More or less coherent, anyway, and endlessly fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, and great segue. Thank you, Andy, because that is the question I wanted to put to Michael is, how did you take this 100 pounds of information and fit it all into a 5-pound bag? and how do you choose? Because there are so many important stories, and our understanding of the stories change over time. There was probably a time where we may not have talked about Brattleboro's printing connection to slave plantations, or we may not have included some of the authors we did include in this book. Please, I'd love to hear more about that.
As we learned more and more of this story, we met with one another, we talked about it, we started to identify gaps in the story. We saw that more and more aspects of the story touched upon each other in fascinating ways, and so themes emerged, and we built the overall story of the book around certain key themes. One of the chief of which is that the history of papermaking, printing, and publishing in Brattleboro exactly mirrors the history of papermaking, printing, and publishing in the world. And so Printtown is very much the story of printing and of the printed word and the relationship between the printed word and the culture of words, which has such a long history in Brattleboro. And so it was fascinating to discover at every turn how deep this history was, how interconnected all the parts are. The principal industry of Brattleboro for most of its history has been publishing and printing. And so by putting our heads together, by comparing stories, we learned really what holds all this together. And thanks to a wonderful book designer, Jim Brisson, and a wonderful art editor, Stephanie Green, we were able to tell this story in both text and in pictures, and the result is what you see here. 100 years ago, a woman named Mary Cabot produced the Annals of Brattleboro, which at the time was the definitive history of our town. Well, now, 100 years later, Printtown is the definitive history of Brattleboro and will be, we hope, for at least a century.
And we are getting close to the end of our time. So I would love to start with Michael and just find out from everyone, what was your biggest aha? What surprised you the most when you were going through this whole process, either a person or a story or a piece of history?
What surprised me the most was discovering that this town that I'd been so drawn to about 10, 15 years ago, for reasons that I couldn't entirely fathom, turned out to be like a salmon going back to spawn. That this is a town for writers, it's a town for editors, it always has been. And then to discover that this history is so deep in the bones of this place has been a wonderful revelation. And it's very much a living tradition. There are still a lot of authors and editors and printers and publishers in Brattleboro who are dealing with the world the way it is now.
Thank you. How about you, John? What was your biggest aha besides the con man?
Besides that, well, Michael touched on it, and that was the interconnectedness of people in this town. Aside from the statistics such as 20% of those employed were working for printing, publishing, and writing during the heyday of the early 20th century, everybody was involved with everybody else. This is a small town. And so all of these people involved in the subject that we were writing about were also parents with kids in school. They were also involved in not-for-profit and charity work and this and that. And the cross-pollination of people in this town is just incredible. And you couldn't help, in doing the research, of seeing these names popping up in different contexts. And, you know, they knew each other, and they probably didn't think one iota about printing and publishing. They were all involved in other kinds of activities in this town. So I had a different feeling. Now I have a little better impression of what the hometown feeling is. I'd been away from it for so long, since 1960, that all of a sudden it flooded back. And that was really one of the unexpected benefits of this whole process for me.
Thank you. Nancy, how about you? What was your biggest aha?
I think two things. One was finding out who Clarina was and how influential she had been in the world of women's rights. But the most exciting thing for me, that sort of moment that made it real, was that I went to the land records in the Brattleboro town offices, and I wanted to find out, because I heard that George Washington Nichols, who was a widower when Clarina married him, had a house on Green Street. And so the town clerk and I went through the records, and I found it, and 99 Green Street was the house of Clarina Irene Howard Nichols. And that was just really cool. It made it real somehow. Mm-hmm. And it was it's right above the water cure. So to find out that people, famous people from the water cure undoubtedly visited with her and her husband. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was just really exciting.
So just for the sake of our viewers, would one of you like to quickly summarize the water cure?
Rolf. Oh gosh, I wish Lissa was here. Very short version is that I cannot pronounce his name. Somebody else take his name. Thank you very much. He came here from Germany and set up a water cure to which many famous people came. And a water cure, basically, they would take these incredibly cold baths and then also drink the pure water, supposedly of Brattleboro. And there was also the Lawrence cure, which was based right where we're sitting right now, across the street. So there are two here on Elliott Street. And Harriet Beecher Stowe came and stayed here during the period, I believe, and I sure wish, believe it was around, Lissa is actually the expert. Lissa. Well, at any rate, around the time that Uncle Tom's Cabin was being written, and she stayed here. And what's that?
Lisa Mayhow.
Oh, thank you. So, and many other famous people. So it was a huge draw to Brattleboro.
Thank you. Andy, I should finish with Rolf. What was your biggest eureka or aha moment?
Gosh, there's too many untold stories that didn't actually make it to the book. So I'll just say again, here on Elliott Street, there was a young man named Ira Spalding in the early 1900s who took a fancy to flying planes, and actually it was named like the vice president of a school which could teach women how to type, do stenography, and men how to fly planes. And their goal was to make Brattleboro an aviation center of the nation. And it was based at first where the Shinla building is downtown, the Ullery building. So that was fascinating.
That could still happen. You never know. Andy, how about you?
Well, part of the fun has been working with Rolf and his enthusiasm for all of these weird, obscure little facts that he was always pulling up, some of which were very important. I guess Bob Anderson, who is a book designer, and I worked with back when I was with Stephen Green Press, told me he had gone to this famous meeting where all these people came together to sort of come up with ideas and who wanted to be involved. And he had then gone out and talked to a couple of young recent college graduates who had moved to Brattleboro. And he had said that he'd been at a really interesting meeting where they had talked about the history of publishing and printing in Brattleboro. And this couple said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, well, Brattleboro was a very important publishing." And they had absolutely no idea. They'd been here for a year or something. So many people in Brattleboro did not understand it. That got me really turned on to the idea of developing this book so that we could come to grips with this important part of our past. My aha moment was that I loved the idea of delving into the Indian connections, the Abenaki information that Rich and others had come up with. And Bob Anderson had just before that asked me if I had seen something on the Indian Bible. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, the Indian Bible and its importance in the whole history of printing." He had just seen one down in Cambridge. Well, it turns out that there was a Native American Christian who had gotten engaged. He had gone to Harvard the third year of its existence when it had been founded as an Indian school, given money to educate Indians. And there can't have been more than a couple of dozen people who had gone through it. And he learned, he already spoke about 4 or 5 different Indian languages and was fluent in English, and he was a Christian. And so he got engaged. He was working for a local printer who was working with a press that had been brought to America about the same time as the Stephen Day Press, which was the first authentic printing press in America. And, all these stories connecting. And he had become very good at printing. And so he was hired to print up all kinds of interesting books, one of which he worked with the printer to develop, which was a Bible in English and Massachusetts, which was one of the Indian languages. And he basically put it together. And wow, I didn't know that. Well, what possible connection with Brattleboro? I love the idea. Well, it turns out that he met a woman who had, this is a long story, I know we don't have time for it, but go and look it up in the book. This woman had been captured by a group of Indians in southern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and brought as a sort of servant. And she was brought up, of all places, as the Indians were escaping the British in the King Philip's War, to Brattleboro. And in Brattleboro, at the area which is called the Wantasticook, which was the meeting of the waters, where the waters disappeared into the earth, so important to the Indians, they escaped up the Connecticut, right to the north end of Brattleboro, leading the Indian rebellion of King Philip's War. And because children were dying in her group, she turned around and ended the war right there. She was the Indian queen. She was the one who held the whole Indian Confederacy together.
And is this in Printtown?
It's in there.
Wow.
And
okay.
Why was that all interesting? Why did it focus on Brattleboro? I don't know. It's all part of the magic of words.
Thank you. So, quick question I don't know who can take these 2 questions, but we often hear a few stories about Brattleboro's print history, as we've talked about tonight. And one of them, I believe the author Saul Bellow lived in the area Two at one point. Is that true?
Newfane.
In Newfane? And does anyone know what drew him here?
His family had a house in Halifax, and he spent his summers here and became a well-known figure on Main Street. He often frequented the bookstores here, and he helped to establish the very first Brattleboro Literary Festival 20 years ago.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Michael.
And he is buried at the Jewish cemetery off of South Main.
And just a note of history. The Brattleboro Literary Festival ran from 1937 to 1942 in Brattleboro. And not that this literary festival copies that, because that's back in that day. But in Brattleboro, they had hundreds of authors. They had book publishers from all over the Northeast, and they had literally copied the Boston Book Festival. And they even, because the newspapers were involved, and the newspaper was a sponsor in both places, they borrowed cases that the Boston newspaper had made to show these books. And so there was all that kind of interplay there. But it was a huge success over a 4-year period of time. And of course, the war changed everything. So, but that was the first one.
That was one of my aha moments. Wow, there was a literary festival back then. You know, how thick and deep the history, that the vibe of literary is here.
It's in the genes.
Well, and it's somewhat international too, because wasn't the first American edition of the Harry Potter series printed in Brattleboro?
Printed at the Book Press on Putney Road.
And about when would that have been?
The book press flourished from maybe the late 60s until about
something like that, early
1990.
70s.
Is that right? It lasted that long?
And wasn't the first copy of All the President's Men under deep wraps?
That's right.
Yes.
Printed at the Book Press.
That was my chapter.
Yeah.
Yes. And that was another aha.
Yeah.
And the book press was so successful. It was printing Harry Potter 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, churning this out. And the people who had bought it, when they finished it and it packed up, shipped it out, contacted them and said, "Sorry, we're putting you out of business."
The new owners of
The
the
new
book press.
owners.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
You haven't been doing well enough. Well, he couldn't have done any more. No printer could, but they wanted to move south to Tennessee or something, and they wanted, the printers in Brattleboro said, well, we want to go back and buy the book press and keep it going. This is our livelihood. And Quebec Corps said, no, we don't want you to do that. We're scrapping all of your new presses and everything. We want you out of business. Well, and then they came to me not too long after that and said, well, we'd like to have your printing business. And I said, if you were the last printer on earth, you wouldn't get my printing business, I'll tell you.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah,
John?
I was just going to say that I don't have the research to back this up, but I know anecdotally that literally hundreds, if not thousands, of books that were either printed or published or written in Brattleboro have appeared in the New York Times bestseller list. I know for a fact, just in the research I did on specific people and businesses, many books were on the New York Times bestseller list, and they were printed in Brattleboro, most of them. Some were published here as well. Bet It's a Boy, that was a title published in 1942 by Stephen Day Press, sold 200,000 copies in a matter of months, and made the New York Times bestseller list. And that just the tip of the iceberg. Scores of books that were printed by the book press were on the New York Times bestsellers.
And they were designed here. There was Irving Perkins, and he had worked for the book press, set up a design studio, and then would give them to the book press.
So much history.
Just let me add, since you're talking about so much history, one of my pleasures in reading the whole book has been to see how many names are familiar to me from my years of teaching, just showing the deep roots that these families have in the area.
Speaking of finding books, if people want to find a copy of Printtown, how do they go about that? I do know there's been some supply chain issues because we are in a pandemic still. But where can people at least try to find a copy or find more information?
I believe everyone's has some copies. Right Action has some copies. I believe 118 and the Words Project still has some copies. And so, yeah.
The book can be ordered at the Vermont Historical Society website.
So the book can also be ordered at the Vermont Historical Society's website.
Actually, I have the last book right here.
And we shouldn't forget the Brooks Memorial Library and other libraries around town, Guilford and I'm sure Putney. They all have copies. So if you want to read the book, you don't have to buy it. You can go to the library.
Perfect. I have, through the power of magic notes that were handed to me while we were filming, a rumor that Michael has written a poem to accompany Printtown, and I think our audience would really love to hear it.
You would.
And they even have a copy. Would you be willing to read it for the audience?
On the spot.
Well, if my lovely assistant, Melissa, could give me
Oh, that's so cool.
Printtown. There's an epigraph. By words we learn thoughts, and by thoughts we learn life. By Jean-Baptiste Girard. Printtown. There's something about this place, the way word makers and word workers have always come here. They came for the waters, to be cured of their ills. They came summoned by the drums that echoed far down the Connecticut. Come to this place where the West goes missing. Tell the truth, put it to words, and put the words on paper, whetstone paper. This is where the water flows, where the ink flows, where the stories can be drawn from a box of letters and signs and sounds, poems and prose, where the rock inside the river still talks. Come to this newspaper town, this book town, this hot tight town, this print town, this word town.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to all the panelists for joining us tonight. I also want to thank the Brattleboro Words Project, as well as everyone involved with 118 Elliott Street for providing space tonight, and to all of you for joining us for this discussion. Thank you.